Okay, let's start by talking about, in more detail, about how cognitive psychology and social psychology interact. They didn't always, and sometimes they still don't, but they can, and they do. And the general framework for this is what's known in social psychology as the general social interaction cycle. This is as its name implies, it's a generalized framework for conceptualizing what goes on in any form of social interaction. That is, interactions between two or more individuals. The example we're going to use today it applies to the very simplest form of social interaction, what's known as a dyadic social interaction between just two people, but it can be generalized to a wide variety of social interactions between one individual and a group, between one group and another group, and so on and so forth. When you look at how this general social interaction cycle operates, it's a cycle. It keeps going for a while. There's material, there are things that are exchanged between the participants in the cycle, and we assign the participants in the cycle to one of two roles, and this is a more or less arbitrary assignment, though it's not completely arbitrary. First, there is the actor who has the role of initiating some interaction, and most interactions are initiated by one party with respect to another party who responds, and then there's the target who is the object of the actor's action. So as you'll see in a minute, very quickly the target becomes an actor and the actor becomes a target. That's the cyclical nature of this. But we got to start someplace, and we start someplace by assigning one individual the role of actor and the other the role of target. This is what the general social interaction cycle looks like. It's not nearly as complicated as it appears, but this is a framework that's supposed to have all the various elements in it. And what I want to do at the outset of this lecture today is to walk you through it so that you get a sense of what's going on. Actors and targets encounter each other in a social situation. A social situation is defined as the as an environment in which actors and targets encounter each other. So that's basically what happens here. So remember, we've assigned the actor role to the individual who initiates the interaction. So the first thing we have to look at is what happens as the actor enters the situation with the target. And the first thing that has to be said here is that the actor enters the situation with some kind of goal in mind, something that he or she wants to accomplish. That's probably true even in the most mundane of social interactions, where you pass somebody on campus and you say, "Hi, how are you?" And he says, "Fine, how are you?" And you say, "Fine," and you just keep going, passing like ships in the night. Still, your goal was to be polite, or to be a human being, or whatever it is that we do when we say things like that to each other, and even when we respond mindlessly, like, "Oh, I'm fine," you're feeling like you'd like to kill yourself, but you say, "Oh, I'm fine," whatever. But still, the actor enters the situation with some goal in mind, something that he or she wants to accomplish. Let's make it a she, okay, just for once. Let's have a female example. And let's make it something that's somewhere between the mundane goal of buying toothpaste from a clerk and a monumental goal of asking somebody to marry you. Let's just say that she wants to ask the target for a date for Friday night, okay? So that's the goal. That's the goal of the interaction. She sees this guy coming across the campus. She says, "Oh, okay, let's see if we can get a date with him for Friday night." Now, she enters the situation with a fund of social knowledge, a fund of knowledge that concerns herself and concerns the target and concerns the world at large. You don't typically ask somebody that you don't know for a date for Friday night. I know it happens, okay, but it doesn't typically happen. So basically what the person has to do, what the actor has to do, is to consider what he or she knows about all the elements of the social interaction. For example, how badly does she want a date? She obviously doesn't have a date for Friday night. Does she want a date for Friday night, or will she go to the library or go to the movies by herself or sit home and make popcorn or whatever it is that she wants to do? She's got to know something about the target. For example, is he currently dating somebody else? And how serious is this dating relationship? Because if he is seriously involved with somebody else, the answer is going to be no, and she probably shouldn't even be asking. And then she's also got to know something about his relationship to her. Like, is it possible that he might be interested in me? So that's at one level, okay, concerning the self and the target. And then the actor has to have a bunch of other information about the world at large. So, for example, what's going on? Is there a good concert up at the Greek? Is there a good movie downtown on Shattuck? Is there some kind of event that they can go to? Are there any parties going on that weekend? So there's this generic information that's immediately relevant to the goal of the interaction. And then she's got to have a set of skills. The first skill she's got to have is the skill of starting a conversation. And that's not easy. It's not trivial to start a conversation cold with somebody you're just kind of coming across the campus. Mostly they expect you to just kind of smile, you know, to say, hi, how are you? Terrible weather, isn't it? And you say, yeah, terrible weather, really sucks. And you kind of go on. But then, see, they've done that. She meets them, hi, how are you? Terrible weather, yeah, it's terrible weather. I'm doing fine otherwise. And then there's this thing, right? Where you go, oh, how would you like to go out with me Friday night? Or words to that effect. That is a non-trivial social skill, how to move a conversation from one direction to another, and especially how to bring the subject of the conversation around to Friday night. So some of these skills are cognitive in nature, and other of these skills, you know, skills in reading people. Does he look interested in me? You know, is he being friendly? Whatever. And then there are basic skills, just social interaction skills about how to do various kinds of things. So all of that is being brought by the actor into the situation before much happens in it at all. Then she's got to begin the interaction. And she begins the interaction basically by forming an impression of the situation, forming an impression of the target, and forming an impression of the immediate context. Probably not a good idea to stand in the middle of campus in a pouring downpour rain to ask somebody if he wants to go out with you on Friday night because he really just wants to get dry, all right? But so you say, well, maybe it's not a good time, or gee, that wasn't a very good greeting he gave me, maybe I should lay off this, whatever. So she has some reason already to think he might be interested. She's got to figure out whether he's still interested and whether this is a good time to ask. And again, that impression of the situation is derived first from information extracted from the stimulus. What his facial expressions are like, what his posture's like, what the tone of his voice is. And then there's knowledge stored in memory. Like, you kind of know that on a day like this, you don't want to stand outside and ask somebody for a date. It's better to kind of walk into the library or a cafe or something like that and then do it. So the actor has entered the situation with a goal and with a set of knowledge, what I'm going to call later on social intelligence, then forms an impression of the target. And the next thing the actor has to do is to act. It's the impression, the perception of the target in the situation that is going to determine whether she acts and, in fact, what she does, okay? So what the actor now does is go for it. She says, hey, you know, I haven't seen you in a long time. And he says, well, you know, I've been in France for a year abroad and all this kind of stuff. And then she says, gee, you know, are you busy? Would you like to go to a movie Friday night? We can get caught up, okay? So she has done that. Her impression of the situation has been favorable. She takes a chance. She acts with respect to the target. And now the ball is shifted to the target's court. He's got to respond in some way. The target isn't just a passive participant in all of this. We're not talking about billiard balls and reflexes here. But now the attention of the analysis shifts to the target, and he has got to take on the role of actor. He has to do something. So the target has to respond. Now, first thing is the target has himself now entered the situation. He's either entered the situation passively by just happening to be there when she's walking by, or maybe a little bit even more passively by being dragged into the situation. She waves at him across the quadrangle and calls him over, whatever it is that she does. Or maybe he's been really active. He takes the effort to walk across the quadrangle to see her. However he's entered the situation, he's now in it, and he's got to do something as well. Now the target carries his own fund of social intelligence, his own set of knowledge and beliefs and skills and all of that kind of stuff that bears on social interactions like this. So, for example, he's got, oh, geez, I remember her from freshman year. She was really strange, right? Or, oh, I remember her from freshman year. She was always asking me out, Or, my roommate was talking about her last night, and she's really gone crazy since freshman year. I don't want anything to do with this. Or he says, oh, gee, I haven't seen you for a while. I kind of liked her. I didn't really ask her out for a date when we were freshmen. Maybe this is my chance. Whatever it is, he's got a set of knowledge about her that he's brought with him into the social situation. And now he's got to form an impression not just of this situation, but also an impression of her. One thing he now knows about her that he didn't know before is what? She doesn't have a date for Friday night. Okay, so now he's got to think about this. Okay, yeah, she's interested in him. That's something he didn't know before too, but she doesn't have a date for Friday night. Why not? Okay, lots of good reasons, some bad reasons, but he's got he has this information. Moreover, I'll get to you in a second. Moreover, he's got his own goals. Okay, maybe he's got an exam coming up on Monday and he really wants to study Friday night. Maybe he's already involved with somebody. Whatever his goals are, they're also brought to bear on the situation. And he's also forming an impression of the actor, the woman who's the other partner in the social situation. An impression that is, first, he already knows her a little bit, okay, so he's got that impression, and then an impression that is revised by whatever action the actor took to begin with. If she says, gee, you want to go out for a date, he sits back and says, oh, that's kind of a gutsy move. She wasn't that kind of person before, Or suppose she doesn't ask him for a date. Well, he had to take that door and say, oh, I guess she's really not interested in me still after all these years. Whatever it is, his impression, whatever impression he brought with him of her into the situation is now being revised by virtue of her behavior in the situation. Now, you had a question or a point?
You said that the guy is assuming that she didn't have a date on Friday night. She might have other plans, but her priority might be.
Okay, that's fine. Okay. Now, she could have a date, and if she gets a date with this guy, she can call this other guy up and dump him. Okay, that's a possibility too. And you've got to think about this. There are endless possibilities, and the next time somebody asks you for a date, watch yourself think about every one of them. Okay? That's what the cognitive point of view on social interaction is. We're thinking all the time about what's going on. We're trying to figure out all the time what's going on. And we may figure it out wrong, right? It doesn't matter from the point of view of this analysis. If you get the impression wrong, you're still going to act. His response now is going to be based on his overall impression of the situation. So he does that, okay? So the target responds based on his overall impression of the situation. And now what happens is the focus shifts back to the actor, okay? Suppose he says no. Gee, I can't. Just like that. I'm sorry, I can't. Now he said no, but he doesn't provide any other information. Suppose he says, gee, I can't, I got a test on Monday, or I gotta go visit my aunt in Oakland on Friday night, or I gotta wash my hair, or whatever it is that he's going to say. And now what happens is the focus shifts back to the actor because she's got to figure out what to do next. So suppose he says no, okay? Then the focus shifts back to the actor. The actor has to figure out what to do, and suppose she says, well, how about Saturday night? Okay? Now that's interesting because that provides him with yet another couple of pieces of information. First, this is one determined person. She wants to go out with him. Second is, she doesn't have a date for Saturday night either. All right? Which is, again, there's nothing wrong with that, as they say, but still, I mean, that's information that you've got. So now he's going to interpret her response to him. That's going to revise his impression of her, and the whole thing is going to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. That's why we call it a cycle, until somehow they get out of it. Okay, he says, no, I told you, I have an exam on Monday. I can't go out this weekend. I got to study because I'm way behind. Or he says, oh, if I study on Friday, I think I'd be ready for a date on Saturday. That sounds okay. Got to be a short one, though, because I got to get up early on Sunday to review my notes and stuff like that. Whatever, okay. Then he's going to respond, and then she's got to deal with that. The cycle continues until the interaction concludes some way, and they continue in the directions in which they were moving to begin with, moving out of the situation. Okay, so now that's the cycle that occurs between the two participants in the social interaction. But it turns out, okay, the actor forms an impression, acts, the target is brought into the situation or enters the situation voluntarily, interprets her action, forms and revises his impression of her, responds. The actor now has to interpret the response, and the cycle starts all over again. But it turns out that there are cycles within the participants as well, that each of these participants is changed in some way by his or her behavior. So, for example, as she was walking across the quadrangle and she sees this old friend from freshman year, she would say, gee, I'm really not seeing anybody at the moment. I'm kind of lonely. I'd really like to have somebody to go out with. I've never asked a guy for a date before, okay? And now she's done it, right? And now what's one thing she knows about herself? She can do this. Right? She didn't know that before. She said, okay, maybe it won't go all that well this time, but I can do this. I can start practicing. She starts, asking all these guys out, whatever it is that she does, right? And then when the target responds, he also learns things about himself, about his ability to negotiate these kinds of relationships. Maybe he's never been asked out before by a woman. That can happen. And he's, okay, gee, that's kind of interesting. I don't really know what to do. I've always been the initiator of these kinds of things, and now he learns he can deal with that. So again, at the same way that the actor and the target are forming and revising impressions of the situation and of each other on the basis of their behavior, the actor and the target are forming and revising their impressions of themselves on the basis of their behavior. All of this knowledge is kind of bubbling up, and their actions in the situation are guided by their perceptions of themselves and the other person, their knowledge about themselves and the other person, their knowledge about what to do and how to behave and all of that kind of business, okay? So that's it. That's the general social interaction cycle. And if you look at, even, as I say, whether it's a mundane or a monumental social interaction from this cognitive point of view, you see that it'll take you a long way to figuring out how cognition plays a role in social interaction. And one thing you might want to do is kind of keep this general social interaction framework in mind as you watch or perhaps participate in various kinds of social interactions and see pretty much how it works out. Okay, That's it intuitively, okay? No technical discourse, no computer simulation model, no nothing, but a general idea about how social interactions go from the cognitive point of view. Now let's start to get a little bit more concrete and begin to bring scientific psychology and other aspects of cognitive science to bear on this, what is admittedly, at the moment, a relatively naive analysis of social interaction. We've used terms like impression and perception and memory in a more or less ordinary language way. The whole point of a scientific discipline like psychology is to get concrete about these kinds of things, to get technical about these kinds of things, and that's what we want to do next. Okay, last time I talked a little bit about the nature of social psychology. What I want to do is to trace kind of how we got to the social interaction cycle, how it is that we got to this cognitive analysis of what transpires between two individuals, between an individual and a group, between two groups as they encounter each other in some kind of situation. Psychology has been defined since roughly the time of William James as the science of mental life. I like to define social psychology in particular as the science of mind in action. What social psychology, viewed from a cognitive perspective, tries to do is to understand how our mental states, our mental processes, play a role in our interactions with other people. Remember last time we talked about how social psychology connects the psychological level of analysis to the social level of analysis. This is one way in which it does it. So the general idea here is that in order to understand what goes on in any social interaction, you have to understand the social situation in which that interaction takes place from the participant's point of view. How they perceive the situation, what they think, what knowledge they bring to bear on the situation, and so on. Social psychology begins really with the work of Kurt Lewin, the European emigre to the United States, came here in the 1930s as a refugee from Hitler's Europe, who offered another general framework for understanding social behavior in terms of what's sometimes known as Lewin's formula, what's sometimes known as Lewin's grand truism, okay, which is that behavior is a function of the person and the environment. That's why it's called the grand truism, because like what else is there, okay? But when you look at this, I mean, Lewin was no dope, okay? He was not a lazy thinker. What's interesting is what happens when you unpack Lewin's grand truism and you try to figure out exactly how personal factors and environmental factors conspire to get us to behave the way we do. So here, B refers to overt behavior, actual actions that take place in the real world. P refers to factors that are internal to the person's traits, motives, beliefs, attitudes, goals, feelings, all that stuff that rumbles around inside your head that we call generally what the mind does. And E refers to factors in the external environment, what's going on in the world outside, whether it's the social world or the physical world. This formula, traditionally, has served as the basis for dividing the psychology of personality from social psychology, so that for most of the history of psychology, personality and social psychology developed as two different subfields within the larger science of psychology. So you get what you might call two cultures in personality and social psychology. One, traditional personality psychology, which emphasizes behavior as a function of a person, which argues that the reason why a person behaves the way he or she does is because the person's behavior is caused by certain internal states and dispositions, traits, attitudes, emotions, motives, values, beliefs, whatever it is. Traditionally, for example, personality psychologists would take a piece of behavior like person behaves in a friendly manner, and then say, why does the person behave in a friendly manner? And the answer would be, because the person is high on a trait of friendliness. Okay? High friendliness causes people to behave in a friendly manner. We know that people have a trait of friendliness because they consistently behave in one manner as opposed to another. It's not exactly circular, but it's close. But the point is that traditional personality psychologists always explain behavior in terms of some feature, some trait of the person, some psychological trait. And they consider the environment as noise to be averaged out. Friendly people tend to behave in a friendly manner no matter what situation they're in. The environment is noise. The signal is the trait of friendliness. On the other hand, traditional social psychology has focused on the environment as a determinant of behavior, whether it's the physical environment of heat and humidity and crowding and height or whatever, or more properly the social environment of other people and what they're doing. From the point of view of traditional social psychology, people are noise. The environment isn't noise, people are noise. What you've got are situations that control behavior. People behave in a friendly manner when the situation calls for them to do that, okay? People smile when other people smile at them. People smile when they're in a role that requires them to smile at people. If you're the greeter at Walmart, you gotta smile even if you think you're dying. Because it's your job to smile at people. It's got nothing to do with you. It's an environmental press that's making you do these kinds of things. And again, no matter who is employed as a greeter at Walmart, whether they're friendly people or unfriendly people, their job is to smile at people and behave in a friendly manner. The friendly behavior is created by the environment, not by anything about the person. Okay. Again, personality psychology, emphasizing behavior as a function of the person, and traditional social psychology, emphasizing behavior as a function of the environment, have proceeded for a long time as two distinct fields, basically treating personal and environmental determinants of behavior as if they were independent of each other. That whatever traits and emotions and motives or whatever the person has that leads him to behave the way he or she does, they're features of you, just like your hair color or your eye color or your skin pigmentation or your height or your body mass index or whatever are features of you. They're part of you. You take them from one situation to the next, okay? Traditional social psychology says much the same thing about the environment. Anybody put in a particular environment would tend to behave in a particular way because of the press of that environment. We're going to focus in this course a little bit on the implications of this idea that behavior is a function of the person. And the first thing I want to do is to link this doctrine of situationism, which controls the traditional point of view within social psychology, to another point of view in psychology in general, which is behaviorism. Okay? John B. Watson worked a revolution in psychology in the 19-teens and 1920s by arguing that William James was wrong, that psychology is not the science of mental life. Psychology is never going to get anywhere if it tries to understand people's mental lives, because people's mental lives are inherently private and subjective. And psychology is an objective science that tries to describe and explain publicly observable events. There is a mismatch between the nature of the mind and the nature of science from Watson's point of view that suggested that we needed to think about psychology in some other way. And Watson set off the behaviorist revolution in psychology basically by saying, look, we're going to redefine psychology as a science of behavior. We're going to say, look, what humans are, they're not thinking people. The hell with Descartes, right? Descartes said, cogito ergo sum ergo cogitans. I am a being that thinks. Watson says, none of that, okay? Humans are just behaving organisms just like any other organism, and it's behavior and the conditions under which that behavior occurs that can be objectively described, okay? So basically Watson argued that mental states don't cause people to behave the way they do. It's not our thoughts and our beliefs and our feelings and our drives that cause us to behave the way we do. It's the stimulus environment that causes us to behave the way we do. And even if that's true, we have to behave as if it's not true because we can't study this, right? It was kind of, well, he wasn't agnostic, but you could have a kind of friendly version of behaviorism that was agnostic. Humans are behaving organisms, and the whole point of science is to, scientific psychology is to describe behavior objectively and to describe objectively the situations in which that behavior occurs. This idea that what psychology is all about is behavior related to the conditions under which it occurs is exactly what Lewin had in mind when he argued that behavior was to some extent a function of the environment. Behavior was to some extent a function of the situation in which it occurs. And we get social psychologists picking up on the behaviorist revolution very quickly. Here's Floyd Allport, who's a pioneering American social psychologist who embraces behaviorism completely and says, look, turns out that there are only two forms of social behavior. The first is behavior that occurs in response to the stimulus of another person, and then there's behavior that serves as a stimulus to another person's behavior. It's a complete stimulus response framework for thinking about behavior. Personality, all that stuff about traits and motives and desires and goals and all that kind of stuff, that's simply the person's characteristic reactions to various kinds of stimuli, kind of like a habit. Our attitudes, whether we like something or not, they're simply preparations for response. So in each respect, Floyd Allport tried to reduce the constructs of social psychology and the topics of social psychology to behavior. What happens very quickly as a result of Allport's influence, and it was profound, Allport's influence, was that social psychology began to develop as a kind of functional behaviorism. Basically, what the behaviorists referred to as stimulus control, traditional social psychologists following Allport referred to as environmental control, and basically they argued, just like any good behaviorist, that the behavior of a person in some social situation was to be explained in terms of the stimuli present in the social situation, the reinforcements for past behavior under similar stimulus conditions, and the ability of the individual to discriminate between one kind of conditioned stimulus and another. Always there is an emphasis on the objective situation and the objective social situation and social behavior as the response to that situation. I think no better example of this social psychological doctrine of situationism can be found than in the work of B.F. Skinner, famous behaviorist from the mid to late 20th century, who basically argued that, again, psychology can't be concerned with the inner man, okay, the free inner man, that no such thing exists. We are controlled by environmental stimuli, and all these alternative causes, all the causes of behavior lie outside the individual, in the environment. That leads us to what I've called the doctrine of situationism in social psychology, which can be simply put that the important causal factors in behavior are external to the person. They lie in the world, the physical and social environment outside the person. And there's basically no mediation between the stimulus environment and the person's response to that environment. You want to understand why a person behaves the way he or she does. Your understanding is complete if you've determined the eliciting stimulus, the discriminative stimulus, and the individual's reinforcement history. Just like pigeons in an operant chamber, just like rats in an operant chamber, social behavior is just like that. So what we get is Gordon Allport, Floyd Allport's little brother, and by far a more famous the social psychologist, actually a personality psychologist, famously defined social psychology in a 1954 historical essay as the psychology of social influence. Okay? How the thought, feeling, and behavior of individuals are influenced by the actual, imagined, or implied presence of others. How what goes on in Allport wasn't actually a behaviorist. He believed that people had thoughts and feelings and desires, but from a social psychological point of view, these thoughts, feelings, desires, and behaviors were influenced by the social environment, by other people, okay? So social psychology wishes to know how any given member of a society is affected by all the social stimuli that surround him. A better translation of behaviorism into social psychology couldn't possibly be found, okay? A better expression of the idea that behavior is under situational control also couldn't be found. I'll skip over these kinds of things for a moment. I think a classic example of situationism in social psychology is found in a famous, I would think infamous, experiment by Stanley Milgram on obedience to authority. Is there anybody here that doesn't know the Milgram experiment? Nobody will admit it anyway. Okay, you all know the Milgram experiment, right? Two subjects are brought together into a laboratory, ostensibly for a study of the effect of punishment on learning. One subject is apparently arbitrarily assigned to the role of teacher. The other one is apparently arbitrarily assigned to the role of learner. The learner goes into another room. The teacher stays in this room, presents lists of words for the learner to learn, and when the learner recalls the list and makes a mistake, every time the learner makes a mistake, the teacher is supposed to flip a switch which will deliver an electric shock to the learner in the form of punishment, and that's what the Milgram experiment is all about. The way the thing is scripted, the learner is, of course, not a real subject. The learner is a confederate of the experimenter who's following a prearranged script. The only genuine subject in the experiment is the so-called teacher. And what happens is, with every error that the learner makes, the teacher is supposed to increase the shock level. The shock device, I don't have a picture of it here, but you've probably all seen the picture. It's this really just piece of breadboarded electrical equipment with these switches, and up at one end of the switches is a little label that says XXX, okay, lethal shock, do not exceed, right, or words to that effect. And what Milgram discovered was that almost all of his teachers, about 65%, went right to the top of the shock level, past intense or extremely intense or dangerous, right to XXX, the very bad, just because there was the experimenter standing in the back with a white coat and a clipboard, and whenever the teacher said, geez, the shock's getting really high, the experimenter said, the experiment requires that you continue, you must go on. And at that point, the teacher said, oh, okay, flips another switch. At some point, the learner, following this prearranged script, crashes to the ground, says, my heart's beating really fast, I think I'm going to have a heart attack. The teacher turns to the experimenter and says, geez, what am I supposed to do? And the experimenter says, the experiment requires that you continue, you must go on. And what Milgram found was that all these subjects did this. That's the basic Milgram experiment. On the basis of experiments like this, Milgram argued that obedience to authority was under situational control. He observed that almost every one of his subjects went all the way to the top of the shock level just by virtue of a guy in a white coat with a clipboard saying, the experiment requires that you continue, you must go on. And he developed this theory of obedience to authority that basically said that obedience was under the control of situational stimuli. First, whether an authority figure was present or absent. Second, the proximity between the teacher and the learner. Let me back up. If the authority figure is present, you got more obedience. If the authority figure was absent and talking over an intercom, you got less obedience. If the victim's in the same room as the teacher, you get less obedience. If the victim's in a different room than the teacher, you get more obedience. The proximity of the authority figure makes a difference, and the institutional context makes a little bit of a difference. Milgram did these first experiments at Yale. He also did a version of these experiments in a rundown strip mall in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is a city consisting entirely of rundown strip malls. And he got a little bit less obedience, but still pretty much a lot of obedience. This is a classic example of traditional experimental social psychology where some behavior, obedience, is related entirely to features of the situational context, like whether an authority figure is present or not. And this exemplifies, I think, the behaviorist perspective on social psychology, because there's no reference to the teacher's internal mental states. There's no reference to the teacher's traits or attitudes or beliefs or knowledge or feelings or goals or motives or anything like that in explaining this behavior. The whole power of the explanation refers to the world outside the individual. Question? Random variation. You know, your experiment's not going to work exactly the same way for everybody, right? You put two rats in a maze, one of them's going to run for the cheese faster than the other rat, right? But the basic thing, you know, is that that's all pretty high levels of obedience to authority, right? Nobody doesn't stop it, and the learner starts complaining about here, right? Almost everybody keeps going, okay? So, again, maybe you could say, well, you know, there's some people who really had a conscience or whatever. Well, not very damn much. Okay, right? And a little bit of conscience, right? So you could say, well, you know, there's this noise. But Milgram wasn't interested in this. He was only interested in explaining obedience with respect to the social situation in which obedience took place. All the rest of it was for somebody else to talk about, and it was just a little piece of the action. The big piece of the action was in the environment. Well, maybe, okay, but again, there quickly arose a critique of this, of experiments like this, and there are lots of experiments. Experimental social psychology in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, just full of experiments like this, all of which vary some aspect of the situation and observe the impact of that situational variance on the behavior of the individuals in it without any reference to their thoughts or feelings or beliefs or desires or anything else like that. Martin Orne, who, full disclosure, was my teacher in graduate school, my beloved mentor, had offered a really interesting critique of the Milgram experiment and other experiments like this, which basically said that Milgram's making a fundamental mistake here because he's erected this theory without considering the experimental situation from the subject's point of view. And Orne argued that if you think about the experiment from the subject's point of view, how the subject perceives the experiment in general, how plausible, there was a deception here, of course, the deception being that the learner was a real subject and he was having these hard problems and all that, how plausible the deception manipulation is for him in particular must be evaluated before you can draw any kind of inference from these kinds of experiments. And Orne just makes just a couple of really elementary points. You think about the Milgram experiment for just 1 second, and you know it's not right. Okay? Let's go back to the original way the thing is set up. 2 people come together for an experiment on the effects of punishment on learning. 1 person is randomly assigned to the role of learner. The other person is ostensibly randomly assigned to the role of teacher. The learner tries to learn, makes mistakes. The teacher records the learner's responses and administers punishment when the learner makes a mistake, all of which is in the presence of the guy in the white coat with the clipboard who's standing in the classic experiment in the same room as the teacher. The purpose of the experiment ostensibly is to study the effects of punishment on learning. What do you need to recruit a teacher for? What's the experimenter doing? Why doesn't he do this? Okay? First big clue is that the teacher role is completely irrelevant to the experiment. Completely redundant. There's absolutely no reason why the experimenter couldn't be reciting the lists of words for the learner to memorize and administering the punishment. Moreover, if you were really interested in the effect of punishment on learning, the experimenter would be in the room with the learner, wouldn't you think? Wouldn't you think he'd want to watch what the learner does when he gets punished? No, he's watching the teacher. So the first thing that must cross the mind of the teacher is, what the hell are you doing here? And the fact that the experimenter is sitting in the room with the teacher and that the role of the teacher is completely nonsensical, completely irrelevant, completely redundant with what the experimenter that could be doing, that the total situation in which the experiment takes place contains a lot of cues that must communicate to the teacher that things are not the way they seem. That, gee, maybe I'm the subject in this experiment, right? Maybe things are, he's been deceiving me all along. The minute the subject, the teacher in this case, begins to think that things are not what they seem to be, 2 things happen. First is that the experimenter and the subject are no longer in the same experiment. Right? The experimenter thinks the experiment is one thing, and the subject thinks the experiment is something else, right? And the second thing is the subject is thinking now, okay, what am I supposed to do? What does he expect me to do? What are the consequences of what I'm doing? Nobody would ever allow such a thing to happen, that somebody's claiming, oh, I got a heart attack, my heart's palpitating, I think I'm going to die, thud, with all this kind of stuff. And the experimenter stands here with his white coat and his clipboard saying, the experiment requires that you continue, you must go on. It doesn't make any sense. Orrin's point is that Milgram made a mistake in believing from the outset that subjects aren't trying to make sense of the situation they're in. Orrin's argument is that we're always trying to make sense of the situation that we're in. We're always forming impressions. We're always drawing on our world knowledge to try to figure out what's going on and what we're supposed to do in it. It's with this critique of Milgram, the Milgram experiment, that leaves mental life and knowledge and cognition completely out of the picture. And Orrin's critique that says, you're never going to understand what goes on in these kinds of experiments unless you understand them from the subject's point of view. From the subject's point of view. Okay? That's the key to the cognitive analysis of social interaction. That in order to understand what an individual does in some social interaction, you have to understand how he or she perceives that situation. You have to understand the situation and the behavior that takes place in it from the subject's point of view. Post your question, or if it's really quick.
I thought as part of the Milgram experiment that the exhibit they extensively debriefed the participants.
Yeah, you can You can debrief people and you can not debrief people. I'm going to pay you for your participation now, and what I want you to do is to tell me what you really thought was going on. Okay? If you tell me that you saw through the deception, what have you just done? You've told me that I've wasted my time and you've wasted yours. You're not going to tell me. Okay? You got to look at that from your point of view, too. Okay? You got to understand the behavior from the subject's point of view. That's the key to the cognitive analysis of social interactions. Thank you very much. We'll take the next step in this on Wednesday.